We are, it would appear, now live, so no one can disagree with what I've just said. Welcome everyone to this latest UK and Changing Europe event in collaboration with the Policy Institute at King's College, represented here by Suzanne Hall. We're here to talk about a report that we have just, and hi Rob, we've just gone live. A report that we've published on our website this morning about popular attitudes towards place, towards what people think about their local area, how they think it can be improved. You can get hold of the report on our website, which we will stick in the Slido for those of you who don't know our website, but I hope most of you do. We've got a lot to get through. We've got 4 people who contributed bits to the report, plus Rob Parsons from Reach, who's going to sort of sum up at the end, if that's okay, Rob. We're just springing this on you.
Sure.
Decided in your absence. So without further ado, Sophie, if you want to kick us off and start talking people through the report a little bit, that would be great.
Yeah, so I suppose the first thing I should do is just explain sort of why we did it. The idea sort of came from the fact that a lot of discussion of levelling up really is focused sort of on the immediate policy areas as opposed to what sort of the public think of the agenda and what they want from it. So that was sort of the starting point for the survey. I will try and share my screen and hopefully it will work. So the 2 things that I'm just going to talk about quickly were just basically that people want levelling up. First of all, it's the idea of sort of redistributing money from sort of these more well-off areas to poor areas is something that's quite broadly popular with the public, sort of across political backgrounds, age, gender, socio-economic status, all that kind of thing. And that's not really that surprising when you look at the data we collected. So as you can see here, the majority of the public in England actually don't feel like their area does get its fair share of sort of government spending at the moment. And you can see that sort of feeling is particularly prevalent the further away from London that you get, particularly in the northeast, where sort of over 90% of people actually do feel that way. It's also quite unsurprising because actually when we ask people how they feel about where they live, the majority of people do feel like where they sort of reside has been in a general sense years or so. So if you see here, we sort of asked about various aspects, sort of improvements for leisure, housing, schools, things like that. But then when we asked people, what their priority is to actually improve where they live, it's not necessarily things that we talk about a lot on the levelling up agenda. So things like high street, schools, shops, things like that. It's actually things which are typically the responsibility of national government. So crime and healthcare were 2 major issues. You can see here that it's definitely 2 significant factors in the way people think their local communities have declined over the last 10 years. And it suggests though, even though people are broadly supportive of the levelling up agenda, the thing they want aren't sort of hanging basket solutions or very sort of targeted, localized solutions. They're actually sort of long-term structural policy areas that require action at the national level. So there is sort of a tension between the levelling up funds and the way it's currently targeted and what actually people want from it in the long term. So that's sort of the 2 areas that I would highlight from the report.
Thanks very much indeed, Sophie. Just before I move on to Suzanne, can I just remind people that you can put your questions in the Slido, and if you want to be really helpful, you can vote for the questions that you'd most like me to put to the panelists. But Suzanne, over to you.
Okay, everyone, thank you so much for that. I'm really pleased to be able to share the findings from the discussion groups that we ran in conjunction with the survey. We did 10 groups in total in collaboration with Nat Sen, and they were held 4 chancellors ago across 5 locations. We did Barking, Nottingham, Barnsley, Blythe and Blackpool, and we spoke to a broad range of participants in each. And you know this, but these groups are not meant to be representative, but they are meant to shine a light on what matters to people. And for some reason I can't, I've clicked now. So when we asked people, what I really want to focus on are their views on local pride, and the specifics varied from place to place, but the groups highlighted 6 key features which underpin this. I think firstly, people really value and appreciate green spaces, areas of natural beauty. And it was often the first thing they mentioned in the groups. They saw these as places that they could go, they could be used by the whole community free of charge, places where they could go and escape the stresses of daily life and recharge. And I think important to say is that people in urban areas, like the people we spoke to in Barking who had access to their local park, they were just as passionate and just as protective about this as people who had areas of outstanding natural beauty on their doorstep. And that maps onto the survey work as well. Heritage was also considered really important. This was typically spoken about in terms of industry, and usually that which didn't exist anymore as well. So like coal mining in Barnsley, the docks in Blythe, textiles in Nottingham. And they thought that these industries gave the area character in terms of the landscape and the people that live there. But for others, heritage was about local landmark. And, people in Barking spoke about the 2012 Olympics, while in Nottingham, they referenced an 1844 Pugin Cathedral. So new or old, it was just local landmarks that mattered. Being represented and being seen as a result was also really important. They wanted their area to be known, and they wanted it to be appreciated in the way that they appreciated it. And popular culture is one way in which this can happen. So participants in Barnsley talked a lot about Kes and how this said something about the area to other people, while people in Nottingham explained that wherever they went in the world, they were known as Robin Hood City. They stood for freedom, for justice, for fairness. More broadly, having ambassadors was thought to be really important, someone that can promote the area nationally or on a global stage and act as inspiration for people still living there as well, that they can make a success of themselves. So there was a participant in Barnsley who talked about cricket umpire Dickie Bird and how he's known all over the world and he's never lost his accent, whereas people in Nottingham spoke about Paul Smith and the work that he's done to promote the heritage of the city. Sporting success was also talked about. So participants said, it helps raise the profile of the local area. So participants in Blythe talked about FA Cup runs that the Spartans had, and that meant that they were on match the day. So everyone could see their town and their local club. It also gives people something to cheer about. And crucially, it gives them bragging rights over their local neighbours as well. So there was one participant in Nottingham we spoke to who said he'd made an incursion into Derbyshire when Forest got promoted to plant the Forest flag on their neighbours' gardens. I don't know if he's gone back to claim it back since they're now at the foot of the table, but we'll see. And it sort of ties back into how people think about regional inequality. It's not how you're doing against London necessarily, it's how you're doing against your neighbours that really matter. And finally, accents and dialects and character were all features that drove local pride. They're what makes the area distinctive, what makes it recognisable. So participants in Nottingham spoke about calling each other Midduck, and one participant in Barnsley really talked at length about how special their accent is, and they couldn't resist having a little dig at Sheffield while they were doing this as well, which I quite enjoyed. They said, Barnsley has a very strong accent. You can pin it down wherever you are. It's unmistakable. You could be in America and you'd recognise it. It's lovely to hear, even to us, and it's much better than a Sheffield accent, which is very idle. So that shows them. But I'm just going to finally finish off by having a look through the fact that, this sense of pride doesn't blind participants to the real and pressing issues that they're facing. And they think that this is a historic lack of investment, but also a lack of understanding from Westminster about what they need as well. And as Sophie said, what they want is things that national government are responsible for, not necessarily local authorities. But the 5 main problem areas that they identified are, limited and affordable suitable housing. And the problem here is if you can't afford your housing, you're going to move somewhere else. A lack of decent job opportunities, so something with stability, something with opportunity for progression. And the situation as it is at the minute made people really sort of think back fondly to former industries that they'd once had. And, they didn't necessarily want a return to coal mining or a return to shipbuilding, but they did want what those industries represented. So a good job, as long as you want it, and something which gives their place a sense of purpose. Failing public services, health and education, but transport. And again, this shone a light on regional inequalities because people in Blythe were looking to Newcastle and wanting a metro system. And finally, they talked about the high streets and, as a rule, how unappealing they were. On all of this taken together, left participants proud of their area, but really sympathetic to the reasons why people move away. And it's this that they really resented, because they knew that as a result, community ties would weaken, which we know is so fundamental for local pride. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. Do keep your questions coming in on Slido. I'm currently struggling with the idea of sporting success in Barnsley, but anyway, we'll leave that to one side for the moment. Lawrence.
Just getting there. Share screen on the conference. Navigate property. Okay, so thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today discussing this really interesting research with you. My name is Dr. Lawrence McKay. I'm a research fellow in politics at the University of Southampton. This subject's sort of really close to my heart. I study the geography of political attitudes and political trust. So I'm really excited to be able to share these results. So my presentation today will be also addressing the themes of civic pride that Suzanne's just talked about, but based more on the survey research. So we ran a survey of over 20,000 participants up and down the country, and that's 20 times larger than the kind of standard public opinion survey that you might see. So the sheer size of that is, we're not just showing off, it's actually important. It means we have a good picture of what all sorts of voters think about across regions, demographics, and types of places. So we have decent samples of all of those different kinds of electorates. So as we say in the report, the government has placed local pride at the centre of its levelling up agenda. The white paper from earlier this year states that one of the 4 objectives of levelling up is to restore a sense of community, local pride and belonging, especially in those places where they have been lost. So we're really interested in interrogating that narrative about the loss of pride, the lack of pride, and identify the possible roots of lost pride where it exists. So the first piece of analysis I have to show you is the level of pride across England's regions. While we have other measures of pride in the survey, here we're just using responses to the question, how proud or not are you of the area you live in? The blue bars indicate being very or quite proud, while pink and red are not very and not at all proud. Now, the levelling up debate is a project with a strong focus on the north, where the loss of industries that provided the source of identity is seen as having damaged community pride. So we might kind of expect then to see overall lower rates of pride in the north, but this doesn't really emerge from our data particularly. So the gaps between areas of the north, south and Midlands regions are quite marginal. Another take on pride is that actually it's been maintained more in peripheral parts of England, but in highly cosmopolitan areas like London, people are kind of more rootless, transient, and we would observe less pride there. That's the kind of somewhere, anywhere distinction you might be familiar with from David Goodhart. And London does sit at the bottom of the league table here, but still 70% of people say they're proud of their local area in London, so that's not much of a gap to the rest. The only region here that seems to stand out for high pride is the southwest, and we don't really know why that would be, but we'd be interested to hear any thoughts on that. Overall, though, this really doesn't look like a regional story in the way that some might have expected. So next thing we looked at was the type of place that people lived in. From our survey, we could kind of geolocate people quite precisely, which other surveys often can't do. We locate people within lower super output areas. That's a type of census geography, which is about 1,500 people on average, about 650 households, and there are 30,000 of them or so across the UK. We use some data from the House of Commons library to code those onto the classification from the Centre for Towns, from villages up to core cities. And these are the results. So in this levelling up discourse, there's often a lot of focus on towns, particularly small and medium-sized towns. There's a lot of analysis out there that suggests they're struggling both compared to both rural areas and bigger urban centres. So, for example, they're often losing younger people who move away for study or work. In policy terms, the government put the focus on levelling up towns with things like the Towns Fund. But actually, we don't find that much evidence of a problem in towns. If anything, small towns have significantly stronger pride than many cities. We're seeing nearly 80% of people in small towns say that they're proud of their area. And meanwhile, there's a bit less pride in what's called the other cities. The core cities are basically 12 of the biggest population centres. So, for example, Leeds is a core city, but nearby Huddersfield, Bradford and Wakefield are other cities. Pride in the other cities is down below the national average at about 64%. But far and away, what stands out here is the level of pride in villages. The sense of pride is unanimous and often quite strong. And I think the rest of the survey gives some nice context to that finding. In particular, the lack of crime stands out as the biggest positive for our rural dwellers. And we've got reason to think that high crime rates are a big blow to feelings of pride. To investigate in more depth, we bring in a lot of demographic factors captured in our survey, including education, age, earnings, economic insecurity, and home ownership. And we break down community types a bit differently, using data from the Office for National Statistics. So they cluster communities into 8 different so-called supergroups based on 59 different variables, including health, employment, housing, and ethnic mix. The picture that emerges here is, we think, quite intriguing. So first, it does look like community type does matter beyond just this villages, towns, and cities divide. So, for example, along with rural areas, suburban areas emerge as quite high in pride. There's a lack of pride in the hard-pressed communities, which are kind of white working class former industrial areas that often have fewer degree holders. But then we see that also in dense multicultural living areas, which are focused in larger cities, pride is lower. And that seems heavily related, based on some evidence from the rest of our survey, to their sense of a worsening crime problem. And it's important to note, though, that other types of multicultural areas actually have high pride. So, for example, if you look at the inner city cosmopolitan areas that are high in knowledge economy jobs. And the other story here, more to do with demographics, is one about age, property, and economic security. Pride seems to increase with age, with home ownership, with income, and is higher among those who think of themselves as economically comfortable than those who say they're struggling to get by. So you could take those things separately, of course, but there does seem to be a bit of a broader picture here. There's kind of something structural going on about how some groups are being literally denied a stable place in their community. You know, they're renters rather than owners and that sort of thing. And so they feel less pride because of that. Of course, those groups are also found in particular places, so it's kind of not so clear whether personal circumstances or environment are the main factors. And finally, in this levelling up rhetoric, one thing that really does hold water is how important it is to turn around a sense of decline if you're going to restore pride. So decline, as some of our presenters have already discussed, is kind of felt in many different respects, from community health services to public transport, and I really encourage you to check out the report to see more detail on that. But here we just zero in one thing in particular, perceptions of high streets. We asked people whether they think their local high street has, over the past 10 years, got better or worse. And the findings are dispiriting. Less than 1 in 5 think it has improved, and around 3 in 5 think it's worsened. So clearly things like the Future High Streets Fund, part of Levelling Up agenda, are badly needed, but also haven't really yet borne fruit. And it seems that what you think of your high street has a pretty strong correlation to pride. And here I'm just going to zoom in on the right-hand side of the slide. Essentially, in the graph, we're plotting pride levels based on perceptions of the high street from much better to much worse. So those blue areas, again, indicating high pride, and the red areas indicating low pride. And those get much, the likelihood of having high pride is much higher when people say their high street's better than a decade ago than when they say it's much worse. Of course, it's kind of hard to see how things are actually going to improve a lot, given the economic crisis we're all facing. But the silver lining is this, that even when people perceive a lot of decline, so they say it's much worse than a decade ago, they're still more likely to say they're proud than not proud, by about 63 to 37%. So I think that speaks to one kind of key theme of our report, that pride is pretty resilient, and as Suzanne has also discussed, people find ways to be proud kind of even in the most struggling areas. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to a lively discussion following the presentations.
Thanks, Lawrence. There are a lot of questions coming in, so I think your wish will be granted, but Will, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Hopefully you can see that and I can onto the first screen. So it is interesting to be talking about levelling up in a context in which it feels like the political agenda around levelling up is flagging, to say the least. But what I'm going to do very briefly is to talk you through some of the findings from the survey that suggest that whoever is in government and whoever is in number 10, whether it's by the end of this presentation or maybe in a few weeks' time, should be looking and thinking about the nature of power in England and in the UK as a solution to the extremely severe, austere period we are facing. And I think it's really important in a context in which trust in government is low, has been in crisis, and we are facing a major economic and social crisis heading into the winter that I think will persist for some time, that we start thinking about what it is that citizens are looking from their politicians. So one of the really interesting things that we did in the survey was we asked people who they felt cared about their area, because on one hand, we're interested in feelings of pride, but it also really matters who citizens think is looking out for them. And one of the rhetorical devices of levelling up as an agenda under Boris Johnson, which I think was very powerful, was a sense it allowed the government and the Conservative Party to say, we hear you, we're listening to the parts of the country that felt left behind, whether in pure economic terms, in terms of social change or so forth. And so we asked people, who do you think cares about your area? And the story, I think, that says that if levelling up is dead, long live levelling up, is a story that decentralization and distance in terms of representation is really crucial to how people feel about who's representing them. So we found that the highest sense of belief that different groups of actors cared about their area was for local councillors. So we asked people, how much do you think the following groups care about your area? And what I'm showing you here is the percentage who on a 0 to 10 scale responded 6 or higher. So you basically gave a positive indication. They thought that or group of people or institution cared about their area. And we see the highest rate for local councillors. 45% of people think local councillors care about their area. And that doesn't make very obvious sense. People know that councillors represent very small micro areas of the sort that Lawrence has been talking us through in terms of actually analysis. People also felt that their local MPs cared about their area. Again, it's now a fairly established finding, I think, that people maybe have a different view of their local MP than they do of Westminster or the government. And people also, 28% also felt that metro mayors, people who were in metro mayor regions, cared about their area. Now, in some sense, as we go down this ladder, the numbers are not especially high to be reassuring. I think we'd all rather like that the 45% of local councillors was higher, and certainly we like the more than 28% of citizens felt metro mayors cared about their area. But these are still better numbers than what you see for the political parties. Now, the fieldwork we conducted was in April and May, so we saw that a slightly greater percentage of people felt the Labour Party cared about the area versus the Conservative Party. As I'm about to show you, there is a strong partisan component to this, and so if we were to rerun the survey again now, I expect we would see a slightly larger party difference here, and we see least of all people feel that the government in Westminster cares about them. So in the context of levelling up, I think it is really important that even as the government, whatever it may look like, seems to be shifting away from levelling up, it may feel it doesn't have the resources to allocate what was already a relatively small allocation to levelling up. That feeling of people that they're being best represented by people closest to them is really important about how we use the relatively small amounts of public resource that we have. So one of the benefits of this survey that we ran that I wanted to show you really is because we were able actually to drill down and ask about specific local mayors. Normally in a national survey, you just wouldn't be able to do this, but we were actually able to put together still relatively small sample size, and in some instances slightly larger, feeling about how they felt that the mayor for their mayoral region cared about their area. And it's slightly a function of visibility. So we can see that Ben Houchen came out top in terms of the most people thinking he cared about their area. It's based on a relatively small sample of 255 people. So it's a little bit of caution required in distinguishing between, for example, Houchen and Andy Burnham, who came in second on 38%, Andrew Street, who came in third on 30%, and Sadiq Khan on 29%. But we see there that there's a certain ladder of visibility, that the best known mayors are the ones who is seen as caring most about the area. We can say, for example, that people who aren't household names down lower down, like Nick Johnson in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, Dan Norris in Mayor of West England, I think probably the relative name awareness really plays a factor in their relatively low ratings. But I think it is important to see that actually we have a mayor like Ben Houchen, you can actually get fairly high ratings in terms of how citizens feel that a mayor's standing up for their area. And this is a really important finding, I think, from the survey, and that mayors can perform that really important representational function. A final slide I'll stop on from is actually the role of politics in those evaluations. So when we asked about how who people thought cared about their area, and we asked about the local MP and the mayor and the government in Westminster, we're able to look at the differences between people who voted for the particular party, whether it was the Conservatives for the national government, or whether it was for the Conservatives for Ben Houchen, or Labour voters in Manchester for Andy Burnham, and see how much they felt that their mayor or their MP or the government cared about their area. And we do see very strong partisan responses. You see that the percentage of people who saying they felt that the local MP cared about their area was almost double if you voted for the party, almost double if you'd vote, well, actually double if you voted for the mayor's party in the election 2019, and over double if you voted for the Conservative Party in 2019. And so, as we see a very broad shift in the national polling of Labour growing a very large lead at a national level, that is, I suppose, a word of caution for the Conservatives, which it's not necessarily going to be straightforward for people like Ben Houchen or Andy Street to sort of lead that kind of decentralized representation that the party stands for, something beyond what's going on in Westminster. And so party politics still really matters, and it still structures those responses and how citizens feel representation. But I think what we've shown in the report is a really clear sense in which locality and localness really plays out on lots of different levels, right from pride right through to benevolence in the sense of representation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Will. I can't help but comment on the determination of this government to wreck our Levelling Up report. At every point in the process of releasing this bloody report, a government has fallen or something that has delayed us. And I mean, the good news is that Liz Truss has got a podium with the crest on it. So she's not calling an election, Will. So that's the first thing to note. But Rob, you're going to have some competition when you speak, because I think you're going to be on exactly when the Prime Minister's on, because she's due on at past. Rob Parsons, for those who don't know, is the editor of the fantastic Northern Agenda newsletter. And if you don't subscribe to it, you should. And not only because it's full of our survey today, it's also good on other days, though not as good. Rob, look forward to your thoughts. And, should the Prime Minister resign, I'll wave.
Thank you, Anand. Yeah, it's a bit of an occupational hazard doing a daily email newsletter at times like this. I think in between me sending the newsletter just before midday and now, when it's dropping in people's inboxes, the political climate has changed quite dramatically, and we have a cartoonist as well, Graham Bandera, who tries to do topical cartoons, and we have our conference about it on a Wednesday afternoon, and we might have to. He might have to do some scribbling to take some of his stuff out for the cartoon that goes in tomorrow. But anyway, that's a whole other story. I thought that the report was really fascinating. It was great. We've been hearing all about it. It's great that it combines a really sort of chunky, quantitative survey with the great insights that come from the focus groups. And some of I guess what stood out to me was the difference between some of the sort of shorter term, more intangible quality of life stuff that comes out in the survey, things like antisocial behaviour and the state of high streets, and the stuff that I guess the stuff that is what it goes on election leaflets and is really matters to people. That's perhaps more than politicians might think. The difference between that and some of the bigger structural sort of issues that are at the heart of levelling up that we there was a report out yesterday. Durham University and the Northern Powerhouse Partnership did a report. They asked 100 or 1,000 Northern leaders what were the priorities for levelling up. And I don't think civic pride was virtually at the bottom of the things that Northern leaders spoke about as being important. It was all about skills and knowledge and transport. And obviously there was some of that came out in the surveys, but I think it's just kind of, yeah, interesting, the dichotomy between what people tend to care about and perhaps some of the bigger, harder to solve problems. And I think one of the things I'm interested in is what this might mean for policy going forward. I mean, I guess what do we know about Liz Truss's government and levelling up? Not very much, but obviously that doesn't really matter anymore because she's going to be out of a job very soon. But I think it's fair to say that efforts by all administrations to try and tackle the problems that levelling up is designed to solve are being held back massively by the constant churn of politicians and policies in the last few years. I think we've been through 4 levelling up or community secretaries in the last year alone, God knows how many education secretaries in recent times. And that means that even if someone like Michael Gove gets his head round what levelling up is and how to tackle it, and the sense that I got is that he did, the Whitehall machinery and its antipathy towards, decentralization means that the shift we need in mindset never really happens. And I think for me and for a lot of people, I think devolution is how we get round this constant churn of people and policy. So you hand over powers to local leaders who know their areas, and they have the democratic mandate and often the longevity to actually do something about it. So I was really interested in the ranking list of mayors and how they rate on perception of caring about their areas and trust, with Andy Burnham and Ben Houchen coming near the top, although obviously name recognition is a big factor in that. And the process of them becoming more empowered to make changes is a work in progress, obviously, but I think that is a really important part of this. And there's an argument that giving them the ability to lower or raise taxes could help, but obviously, as this report indicates, there's a sting in the tail with metro mayors as well. And it seemed to come through quite clearly that there's a perception in some quarters that metro mayors like Andy Burnham, that their success means that the big metro areas, so the big successful cities like Manchester, get all the money. There's a great quote from the focus group. I'm sick to death of money being put into metro areas. It always goes to Manchester, but what about Burnley and Rochdale and Bolton? Which I was interested to see came from someone who lives in Nottingham, who obviously has very strong opinions about northern politics for someone who lives in the East Midlands. But I don't know to what extent the evidence bears out that contention. I think you could point to outlying places in Greater Manchester that are getting investment, but that sense that areas away from the big cities are being left behind, I think was something that Boris Johnson tapped into in 2019 when he won all those seats across the north. And I think if levelling up does survive in any form, it's something that our political leaders and whoever gets the power really needs to have at the forefront of their thoughts to ensure that levelling up sort of has that legitimacy. So yeah, those were a few of my thoughts.
Thanks ever so much, Rob. The other thing I don't understand is why people say they're making statements at 1:30 and then they're always late. Anyway, moving on from that. We've got loads of questions. And so what I would suggest is I'm going to go broadly in, when I've got some questions of my own as well, in the sort of order that they present themselves on my screen, because people have voted for them, but you don't all need to answer all of them. So just chip in, either unmute yourself and start talking or stick your hand up if you want to respond. And first, the elephant in the room, I suppose. How has the chaos of the present government affected the relevance of levelling up? I mean, that's the question that's hanging over all of this, isn't it, I suppose?
You wanted to jump in, Arland? And
I'm not going to say no, now you've unmuted, am I?
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I think it's a brilliant question. It's one that we don't know, but I think what we would say, I think we're already pleased with the report, apart from the cursed timing of every attempted launch. Paula Sarrage, who isn't here, predicted it'd be resignation yesterday. She was saying she'll resign at 12:45 just to make her lives impossible. So we got an extra 45 minutes. But I think what the report shows is But first of all, that the Conservatives and Boris Johnson were completely right to identify levelling up as a sort of broad evidence base of discontent, dissatisfaction, and socioeconomic problems that were incredibly relevant to the UK. And that's not going to go away. Whoever takes over from Liz Truss is going to have to, reconcile themselves with the fact that these parts of the country, many of which voted for Brexit, are looking towards the government to show that they understand the challenges that the country is facing in terms of cost of living, but the broader, deeper structural inequalities. You see huge numbers of people in surveys saying that they think that we should do more to address the inequalities, and the evidence that we've seen in the survey and the survey and the focus groups around civic pride, sense of identity really play out. And so, although levelling up as a bit of rhetoric may be dead, it may be too associated with Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party and a new leader sort of take it on. I think the Conservative Party, and it because of its new electorate, that electorate it won in 2019, will have to find a way to reconcile itself with, and finding, not least because of its most successful politicians, while Westminster is on fire and descends into chaos, people like Ben Houchen and Andy Street are able to tell a story, a positive story about Conservatives in power in parts of the country delivering for their area. And so, although it feels like levelling up is gone, it will have to come back in some form, because whoever takes over is going to have very limited room for manoeuvre.
Anyone else on this particular? You're all watching the bloody iPlayer, aren't you? Anyone else want to come in on this question?
I'd just like to add to that. I mean, I think one important factor of this is it's got an institutional legacy in the form of department that's now called the Department for Levelling Up, a Levelling Up minister. It has a legacy in the Conservative Party internally, in that we have things like the Northern Research Group, who will force this onto the agenda of any prime minister that does emerge from this process. And so I think, and it also has a policy legacy in terms of, there is a bill that is in front of Parliament at the moment, in a levelling up and regeneration bill, that will presumably eventually become law. And so I think, this does have a near-term future. I agree with Will that it may not be put in those words as being central to the government's agenda, however, especially in a time of policy restraint. And the other factor is that this also becomes a club to beat the government with, right? So the Labour line on the budget was, so much for levelling up. Basically, this is a budget that entrenches all sorts of inequalities. So maybe the baton of levelling up just hands over to the Labour Party, and then the focus of the next election from things like the Northern Regional Press will be, well, how are they going to go about delivering levelling up? Rather than tackling, their kind of broader social policy agenda, they will be really interested in, how would you deliver those sorts of investments for the North? So, yeah, I think that's one aspect to look out for.
Okay, we've just lost a prime minister, but we're going to keep going anyway. And Rob, just don't be shy. If you want to chip in, just chip in whenever. We've got quite a specific question on whether the government's funding model is broken, and that it tends to give least deprived schools more funding than most deprived schools. I mean, that's quite a techie thing. I don't know if anyone wants to come back precisely on the government funding model, but I think one of the interesting things from the report relates to devolution, and whether actually the funding model is broken, not just because of the details of the model, but the funding model is broken because it's all held centrally, and quite a lot of it is given out in these ridiculous beauty contests between regions, sort of where regions have to bid. And I'm sure you'd have thoughts on that latter issue, if not specifically on the former. So does anyone want to come in on any of that? You can go first again if you like, Will. Don't be shy.
Okay, well, I mean, I think the sense in which towns were having to bid for funding did leave a little bit of a bad taste in the mouth. But that said, I think we're going to be living through a fairly austere time period, it seems, in terms, although who knows with the new prime minister where things will lie. But I mean, I think that sense in which the way in which resources were allocated did not sit particularly well with citizens. And Lawrence didn't talk about we ran a survey experiment as part of the project. We're asking about the allocation of resources through levelling up, giving people different proposals and different structures for allocating funds. And what we found was that actually, when faced with two hypothetical proposal systems, one of which was giving the allocations based on deprivation versus decisions being taken by MPs, people preferred resources to be allocated based on need, the role of independent experts, and non-political allocations. Of course, now that kind of comes into conflict with the sense in which actually the political value of levelling up and towns funds and so forth is the bragging rights, the fact that the local MP can stand up and say, I'm fighting for the Barnsley High Street and we've won this resource. And so again, I think that is a real tension at the heart of the agenda that's not going to go away, that these processes for allocation do leave a bad taste in the mouth, but they also are what gives levelling up its sort of political lifeblood, and it kind of gives it that sense in which government is doing something for an area. And I think it is that is something that's worth reflecting on about why levelling up was able to sort of strike a chord, was that actually people, when they know government is doing things, don't always appreciate it. Whereas actually, government is spending much larger sums on lots of projects, and the amounts of money involved in Towns Fund, for example, are tiny really compared to big structural economic funds. But giving people £20 million for a local high street can really matter to them. And I think that's because the nature of the things that people care about, really, those sorts of place-based features of where they live really, really matter.
Yeah. Though interestingly, when we did an event at Labour Party conference, Paul Sweeney from the Centre for Cities was saying that, all that sort of tokenistic stuff really is exactly that, and that the long-term problems like skills and education just go sort of sadly overlooked. Suzanne, are you?
Yeah, just to chip in on that, I think there was a lot of discussion in the groups about how these funds were awarded, which I was really surprised by, just how much people knew about it. They were able to talk about which councils had bid for money, how much they bid for, who'd been successful. And it really created this sense of unfairness, because they thought, people in Barnsley were saying, well, if you've invested in Sheffield, if they've just been awarded £20 million, why is anyone going to want to invest the same amount of money for a similar kind of project in Barnsley? They didn't see that there would be the need for duplicating effort in that way. And they also spoke about how it's entirely contingent on skills, and they just didn't think that every local authority had the skills, but also had the capacity to write these kind of bids and put the time into this when there's so many other pressing problems. So they thought it kind of entrenched inequalities as well.
And I think
that really speaks to some things that we found in the surveys as well. So as Will was talking about, we ran what's called a conjoint experiment to determine people's preferences in terms of how levelling up should really work, and how these investments should work, both in terms of what people wanted out of them, the funding that people wanted how much funding people would receive. And essentially they were choosing between different investments that could happen in their area. And actually one thing that came out was if you told them that the system was politically impartial in the sense of it was run by independent experts, people were more approving of those decisions. But then if you told them that in any way ministers were involved, whether or not, even if there was a bidding process that went into it, people were more negative about the investment decision that came out of that. And so that does very much speak to, as Suzanne said, that people are, quite responsive to the idea that, this is potentially a biased process. And I think that's one thing that in the future we'll have to think about, how we can work that element out of the system, because it is quite impacting on people's trust in levelling up.
Thank you. There's a really interesting question from Joseph Owen, who's saying that given that pride is often sort of hyper-local and very place-specific, how can we aggregate it? So if, how do you have a national ambition to increase pride when actually so many of the things that provoke pride are very, very local indeed? I mean, Sophie, I know you've spoken about this. Do you want to say something about it?
I think that's right. I also think The white paper, I think that came out in February, sort of did mention that quite a lot of sort of that being a really big aim of the levelling up agenda. But I think our findings as Landshut is that, you know, this idea that people generally don't like where they live and they want to go elsewhere is just not the case. And it's not just people who live in these sort of more affluent areas, it's actually the case across regions and across different types of area. People are generally quite proud to be from where they are. And it's just that they know what their areas need to get better. They can identify the problems that there are, but they can also sort of propose some solutions for that. So I think sometimes the tone that is used when we're talking about levelling up, and, you know, the idea that people hate where they live and the government's mission is to make that not the case, it actually just doesn't really add up. I think we use a negative tone quite a lot, and that's actually not how people think about where they're from.
I mean, I don't know whether there is a tension here or not. There are sort of two things that seem to rub up against each other here. I mean, one is, you know, as you've said in your presentations, that the big things people want tackling are education and crime and things like that. So national things. On the other hand, people have very specific views of their own locality. Is people's thinking modelled here, or is there a coherent, you know, can you paint a coherent picture of what people think levelling up should be, what will improve their local area most, that, you know, would serve as a sort of prescription for policymakers, or is it just too complicated? Or is that a really complicated and messy question, for which I apologise? You see what I'm getting at? Is, you know, there are two themes that come out of this. One is local and one is national. Which should we prioritise? You know, we spend a lot of time talking about how you need to devolve power to deal with the issues in a proper way that are specific to those areas. On the other hand, you know, I don't think, you know, issues like crime and education, it seems to be people are looking very much at central government, even if they don't trust central government.
I mean, I think it's now I understand the question. I think it's a good point, right? Then in the sense that I think based on what Sophie was saying, and I think the focus groups that, you know, Suzanne presented and led on, I think were great at showing that sense of place and civic pride and identity are multi-layered, right? They are, you know, that sort of sense of the combination of accent, place, you know, kind of the physical environment, right? The sort of the built environment, industrial legacy, all those things are incredibly important, and people's experience of things like skills, jobs, crime are incredibly local, but you're right, they're absolutely in some areas national, right? So actually, you know, so, and I think what it does, you know, I think we were saying earlier before we started, right, it's actually very much reminiscent. I always think of, if we think back to that sense of what New Labour pushing against the Conservatives on antisocial behaviour and crime in the 1990s, there was a sense of which communities were breaking down. You know, crime wasn't being kind of tackled. I mean, it's kind of incredible historical echoes. And so I think it's that policy solutions don't need to be local, but the impact is felt locally. And so I think that, you know, that sense of levelling up doesn't always entail local solutions, but it does really focus the mind that a lot of people's experiences are about how they feel about the place where they live.
Okay, I just want to reassure you, we're going to have a new Prime Minister in a week. I don't know how we're going to have a new Prime Minister in a week, to be honest, but apparently we're going to have a new Prime Minister in a week.
Surely UK and Changing Europe will be responsible for organising the leadership conference.
Absolutely, and we will produce 6 reports between now and the installation of a new Prime Minister. Absolutely. So did anyone else want to come in on my rather sort of garbled question, or would you rather move on?
I think just to endorse that from the qualitative work though as well, is that, you know, like Will was saying, and people were talking about local, feeling things locally, but wanting a national response, but then wanting to be able to, you know, it's quite a muddled response from participants as well. They wanted to be able to tailor those policies locally, and they wanted to be able to communicate them locally as well. So they wanted sort of national directives, but for them to be able to feed into what those were and how they should be embedded in their local area, because they were really of the opinion that, you know, people who lived there understood what was needed best, and they didn't necessarily think that those views were always being taken into consideration when developing national responses.
Anyone else? Okay, here's a question I sort of feel honour bound to put to you. Has Brexit helped or hindered levelling up?
I'm happy to answer this one, not speaking for my employer or the views of UK and Changing Europe in any respect. But I absolutely think it's hindered levelling up. I think there's a clear case that it's hit the tax revenues that we earn at a national level, and that to the extent that we are facing austerity. That's not only because of the mini budget, but it's also because of the reduced national revenues linked to Brexit, and essentially the fact that there's no money left is a real problem. How do you level up when there's no money left, right? And some of that goes to the door of Brexit. So, yeah.
I'll take a contrarian view for Lawrence for a moment, just to say that I think it's an interesting dilemma, right? In the sense that without Brexit, arguably levelling up wouldn't have got on the agenda in the way that it did. Although Lawrence, as my co-author Jerry Stoker would say, well, of course, New Labour dealt a lot with regional inequality. It's not like previous governments, including previous Conservative governments, haven't been mindful of geographical inequality. But I think you certainly could make the counter argument to Lawrence's point that not a structural argument, but the rhetorical and political importance of levelling up, what was accelerated by the Brexit vote and then the shift in the Conservative electoral coalition, which meant that up until very recently, it felt very, very important to the political agenda of a Conservative government that it would be seen to be tackling levelling up. And so I think that maybe the answer to Lawrence and mine's debate would be whether or not the Conservative Party, by the nature of the electoral gravity, is drawn back towards a version of levelling up under a new Prime Minister.
I mean, surely the combination of the two is we quite possibly talk about it far more now than we would have done had the referendum gone the other way. We just have less money to address it than we would have had the referendum gone the other way, and we weren't talking about it. I mean, one of the really interesting graphics from the report is that graphic that shows that far more people believe in giving money from rich places to poor places than they do in giving money from rich people to poor people. So 6 years of rhetoric about place-based inequality from first Theresa May and then Boris Johnson have had their impact and have shaped people's thinking. Now, the problem is that we haven't actually had much in the way of a functioning government since then to do anything beyond words. I mean, there've been, there's been quite a lot of initiatives that are worthy. I mean, the further education white paper, whenever that was, is lost in the mists of time. A couple of years ago, I think, was actually quite a decent policy document. It's just that nothing happened to it because politics took over. And there's been a lot of that going on. I mean, the interesting question is whether, as the battle for the soul of the Conservative Party starts again, any part of the Conservative Party is going to feel able to simply ignore this agenda. And I think they'll struggle, to be honest. Rob, you've been very quiet. I mean, just like I said, feel free to pop in and just sort of... Yeah,
well, I'll just there's one just fairly boring, not boring, well, a technical sort of example of the relationship between Brexit and levelling up. There's a fund called the Shared Prosperity Fund, which was supposedly the successor to the structural funds that areas of the North got pre-Brexit, and the promise was that all this extra money would be pouring into the North as a result of the Shared Prosperity Fund. But when it actually came down to it, it turned out that many places in the North were actually getting less funding under the Shared Prosperity Fund than they were doing under the previous regime. So I think, some of the promises that were made have not borne fruit.
No, absolutely. And, at the same time, I mean, one issue we need to think about, I suppose, is what happens to government borrowing costs in the week we don't have a proper Prime Minister, and, whether it just gets even harder to do the things you want to do because we have even less money, which just seems to be a movable feast. Jack Newman asked the question, how can the link between local preferences and local policies be improved? And he hints that the way is via local democracy. I mean, we talked in broad terms about devolution and local democracy. Does anyone want to sort of say what could and should be changed about our political settlement that would help drive a levelling up agenda that actually suited the needs of local communities?
people in the focus groups were really keen on getting involved more, and it's something that we absolutely push them on as well, because people are very quick to say that they'd be very keen to get involved, but then when you try and get them involved, it doesn't always translate. But I think people were so convinced that they had a better understanding of what their area needed, that this was something that they wanted to see, and they didn't want to see meaningless consultations. They talked about tick box exercises, long forms. They didn't want any of that. They wanted to sit round. They sort of said it's these kind of forums where we're invited in, we're given information, and we're able to speak. And you can see that working in many places across the world, you know, deliberative forums where people are able to come in, they're informed about what could make a difference. And they were the kind of things that participants were really talking about. And there seemed to be a real appetite for that at the minute. I think in no part helped by the lack of faith and trust that they had in politicians to deliver for them for what they wanted.
Yeah, and I think that really maybe goes some way to address a legitimacy problem in local government, right? Which is that essentially not many people turn out in local elections. And the groups that do are massively overly politically engaged. If local elections are timed with general elections, then you get a big down ballot effect of people who come out for the general election also vote in the local election. But yeah, either we need to, massively, in certain ways, increase the importance of local politics to people. But then we've got an issue there of the decline of the local press that's happening in so many places across Britain is really hitting people's ability to understand what's happening locally. Of course, there are many exceptions, but there really are places in the UK that are becoming media deserts on account of this evolution in the media environment. So I think that's something that we need to look at, supporting local media as well.
Absolutely, and there are psephologists out there who will argue that some of the trends we see in polling is down to sort of greater similarity between places, partly because of an absence of local media. And I know Sophie, you've talked about this, but it's one of the really interesting things from this report has been the sort of people have very strong opinions about how money should be given out and what tiers of government should be doing it. And basically, and just tell me if I get this totally wrong, Sophie, the conclusion seems to be that the way the government is doing it is precisely the way people don't want them to do it, which is through sort of these beauty contests.
Yeah, so the Conjoint experiment that Lawrence mentioned before sort of shows that quite clearly, is that any process that sort of involves ministerial sort of ministers or sort of any level of sort of implementation or giving out money is just sort of less popular than one that is sort of more of a needs-based process. And I think, that shouldn't be that surprising when you look at our results on sort of trust in politicians. But not only that, sort of the levels of people who think that the government in Westminster actually cares about their area. I think it's less than, or is it? It's 1 in 10. It's like, it's a really, like, obviously I knew it might not be great, but how bad it was actually quite surprising. And I think in a way it's just sort of people don't think that level of government has that understanding of their area or their needs. I think the other thing as well is that a lot of people say, and I think that comes across in the focus groups that Suzanne conducted, was that quite often the process has been central government just sort of to dump in a pot of money on a local authority that might not necessarily have the resources to implement it in a way that makes the best use of it. So I think that's why people are so much more keen for local, not just local implementation, but actually local consultation throughout the policy development process.
Cool. I was just figuring out how to turn the word lettuce off in Twitter so it wasn't bombarding my.
What's going to happen to the lettuce? That's my big question.
Can I just say, breaking news, Sophie is far too worried about that bloody lettuce. But anyway.
I want it for our office.
What I'm going to do, there are a lot of really good questions and I'm going to put them to you sort of, we'll think of this as a quick fire round, if you like. Oh God, they all keep moving as well. Firstly, what about the survey surprised you? Which findings surprised you? That's a damn good question. That's from.
I mean, I'll jump in with well, I think the finding Lawrence showed us about pride, right? Actually, that I think that sort of that rejoinder to the somewhere anywhere argument around, kind of place and people, rootless cosmopolitans living in major cities, I think is really important, because I think it's, the really great thing about the survey is that it shows that you need a very nuanced account of pride. I mean, actually, I think the survey questions we use are themselves only partial measures of what pride is, why the importance of connecting with the qualitative data. So I think that was my one. The regional differences weren't always what you'd expect.
Anyone else surprised by anything?
Yeah, if I can come in, it's really some of the, we're kind of slapping each other on the back there, really, but it's what Will just presented on the level of trust in the metro mayors, especially how it compared actually a little bit unfavourably to MPs, and that even when you're looking at these figures like Ben Houchin and Andy Burnham, who from an outsider's perspective can look like a bit of a folk hero, like it starts calling him the king the king in the north after trying to campaign for more support during COVID. Actually their figures look relatively mediocre almost. I mean, decent compared to national politicians for sure. But if you're only looking at sort of ratings of about 5 on a 0 to 10 scale, it's not blowing anyone away. So I just wonder, what is it there that's even though they look so hegemonic locally in terms of their vote shares, what is it that's preventing them from developing a broader appeal to their voters?
Okay, the North obviously has a queen, not a king, as anyone from West Yorkshire will tell you. But anyone else? I mean, someone's asking whether from the data, because of the variation in people saying whether their local high street has improved or deteriorated, whether we can pinpoint those places where people think they've improved. Whether we can pinpoint and you can remember, I suppose, is the question.
I think if I remember properly, I would read it to double check that I am. But I think the places that said they were improved were sort of more affluent suburban areas, I think. So I think it was sort of like places like Chester and things like that. I think it was those sort of kinds of areas where quite often you do see, I think there has been quite a lot of like sort of local regeneration away from town centres, but it's a sort of a very specific type of place.
I think we touched on this, but it's from Adrian Gamble. What were the common themes about how people think their area can be improved? Can you summarise the findings on that? I mean, I should encourage you all to download the report because it's massive and there's so much in it, and it's a bit unfair to ask these people to remember these details, but I will anyway. If no one wants to, we can move on. There's a whole load of stuff.
As I recall, number one, it's reducing crime. Number two, it's improving access to local healthcare. And I wish I hadn't started the list of 3 because I can't remember the third one. If anyone can.
I think it's affordability of public transport, I think.
They were definitely things that came out really strongly in the groups as well. It's not just actual crime rates, but it's also the physical appearance of areas that they spoke about, feeling unsafe and not feeling that their local area was necessarily that they wanted to spend time, or somewhere that anyone else would want to spend time as well. Why would you go if you're kind of coming into somewhere that feels unsafe? They also did talk about just cleanliness as well. So, making sure that local high streets are clean, there's less litter, but yeah, education and healthcare were the other 2 big things that they thought would improve their local area, as well as job opportunities. So people really felt the effect of just having very few opportunities for progression, 0 hours contracts, work with no stability. That was something that really spoke to participants and was something that they wanted to see fixed.
Okay.
Yeah,
can I tell you something that? Oh, sorry.
If I could just go back to the previous question as well, on local high streets, not answering exactly the where it has occurred that local high streets are seen as being in decline, but the most positive change that people were seeing on their high streets was the growth of small independent shops. So I think people really identify, not the John Lewis opening up or that sort of thing with improvement, but actually the independence. But I think one interesting thing is, well, there's this big looming threat to the small independents in terms of the energy crisis that remains a threat on account of the 6-month window of support that may expire in April 2023. So I think that's something the government will really want to consider in terms of really damaging a sense of community if those are left to face those challenges.
Rob.
Yeah, so I just thought I did come back to something that surprised me, from which just popped into my head, which was the I was quite interested in the idea of what people think about, the future industries that are coming to their area, and how you were talking about local pride and identity and people associating certain things with their area. But my reading of the report was that people actually aren't that they're not stuck in the sense of, in Sheffield it has to all be around steel, or in the northeast it has to all be about shipbuilding, like traditional industries. That people are more open-minded about what the future of their local area can be. They're not sort of tied down by the history of a place, which I didn't think would necessarily be the case as much as it was.
All right, Sophie, when we've done the last question in about 10 minutes time, you want to share your screen with that bloody lettuce and the disco lights, you can. All right. Incidentally, Lawrence, the first thing they say to us at the media training we do at UK and a Changing Europe is never say in advance how many points you're going to make. They can only, because you'll always forget one of them. There's a really good question here, which is, how does your online survey represent the views of those perhaps most likely to benefit from levelling up, who have no or very limited internet access? Go on, methodologist Jennings.
I mean, it's a very valid question. I think it is. We ran the survey with YouGov, who are very well versed in these methods. It is a challenge with online surveys, but I well enough to remember the original debates around digital divide, digital services of the state and survey companies. I think it is much less true than it used to be. Survey companies go to great lengths to ensure that people who aren't necessarily themselves always online have access. So I can't speak to the specifics of what YouGov do, but many organizations will have panelists who are given equipment to allow them to complete surveys. So to reassure you, the survey has been there's a quota sample to make sure that it's representative regionally, demographically of the population in terms of income and so forth. There may be, very, as ever with any survey, at the very, very margins, the absolutely most private society may be more difficult to reach, but to reassure it is nationally representative and at the highest quality of data. So I can only say that I think and one of the great benefits of using us having being supported to have a 20,000 person sample is that actually we're able to have much greater reliability in those more hard to reach groups that we've got greater numbers of respondents in, for example, low income or from all the regions of the UK. So I think we can be very confident that the story we're telling is nationally representative, but is also representative within those regions, within those demographic subgroups.
I'd summarize that by saying we're absolutely fine, and if we're not, blame YouGov. Does anyone else want to chip in on that? Or to what extent is the levelling up of some areas dependent on the levelling down of others?
I mean, I'll keep going and then someone else go. I mean, I think I think one of the benefits of levelling up as an agenda rhetorically was that it allowed a somewhat not very heavily redistributive program to be framed in positive distributive terms. So I think that in some senses, certainly until the Conservative leadership contest and Rishi Sunak telling the Conservative Party members in Tunbridge Wells that he kind of played with the formulas to make sure that certain areas didn't get resource. I think, but I think there has to be a reality that politics is about hard choices, and about investment in struggling areas does potentially mean the reduction of investment in other areas sometimes. But I think what if I was a politician, which I'm not, thankfully for all of us, I think one would say that actually one of the economic arguments for levelling up and for a government is that we have huge untapped social and human capital in this country in areas that are struggling, where relatively small levels of investment in jobs, skills, place can actually make us collectively far more affluent. And so that's a little bit of turning a sort of a kind of a Remainer type argument on its head, right? Which is actually the EU membership offered a certain sort of economic model, while actually the sort of the Brexit model should be actually that investing in the human capital of our people. I think levelling up on its positive framing has that. It's about investing in local areas and places where some people would actually like to live. I think it was said earlier. I think some of the things said about kind of people getting stuck in areas is a negative framing. People like their hometowns, they want to stay there, and they want the jobs, the infrastructure, the public transport to allow them to do that, to have a better life. And so I think we can, without wanting to kind of be the cakeist, we can have everything, we can have our cake and eat it too. I think it's not a bad thing to make those choices, because there may be long-term benefits from investing in areas that haven't had resources going to them historically.
Though I suppose, two riders I'd make to that is, one, there's an awful lot of poverty in London, and two, actually, there was quite a bit of the sort of anti-London thing about the referendum. It struck me, a lot of that rhetoric floating around, which wasn't necessarily massively helpful, but I think has to some extent shaped some of the subsequent debate. Right, we've got 5 minutes left. Now, again, there is the data here. I'm not sure any of you can remember it, but I'm going to try. Julia Summers is interested in the comparison of the relationship between pride and time lived in the area, age, and other factors. There is a graph, as I recall, that does this. Who memorized it?
I'm going to be so bold as to say I think I have memorized this. So
fantastic.
So actually, so I'll just start with time lived in the area. This is surprisingly weak as a sort of factor for pride. And, it seemed intuitive to us that, if you live in an area for longer, you're just going to have more of those connections that encourage you to feel pride. But actually, it doesn't look that way. It looks like you can be pretty fresh to an area and still feel a level of pride in it. Then if we say, so the second point was age, I believe. So age was a driver of pride. So if you were younger, you tended to have a lower level of pride. And in my presentation, though we haven't really tried to disentangle this causally or anything, it's quite hard to do. I suspect that is something related to being renters rather than owners, and so being rather insecure in an area, perhaps, and not having that sort of tangible stake in a way. Maybe speaking to a sort of classic conservative theme there about the property owning democracy. And finally, what's the third point? Time lived in an area.
Time lived in an area. Age was the other variable.
Yes. Okay, that's it. Okay, that's me done then.
Thank you so much.
Just to chip in on some of those things around pride, is that really came out in the groups as well, and irrespective of people's own socio-demographic characteristics, they were speaking about the same things, and a lot of the things they mentioned had a really long tail. So I mentioned that sporting success was important for local pride, and when people talked about that, one of the first examples that participants in Nottingham gave was Torval and Dean. That was 1984, but it still matters for what's going on in the city. And for someone who supports a football club that hasn't really won anything since 1982, that's great for me when I think about local pride. But all these things matter, and young participants were talking about things that they would have had no personal knowledge of around the heritage of the area, about cultural representation from the 60s and 70s, but it still fed into what they knew of it and what they were proud of.
Anyone else on this? We've got a couple of minutes left. One specifically for you, Lawrence, which is, did you control for whether respondents had a choice about whether they stayed or not, or whether financial status was basically all we asked about?
I don't fully understand the question, but which outcome are we interested in here?
I suppose it must be, it doesn't say in the question, and the question is from Anonymous, so I can't be of much more help. But I suppose the question is, were people making the best of a place that they had to stay in for whatever reason? I mean, is the choice of moving open to you, I suppose, would be an interesting question to put alongside these. We didn't though, did we? In the
So I suppose the main point to make here is that we haven't run regression, so it's not strictly true to say we've controlled for anything, although we could go and do that if anyone wants to write an academic paper with this data. But the point as to whether people are were wanting to move or were stuck in an area, I think that is something we did look at. And actually, to my mind, this was something that surprised me a little bit, that there was a reasonable number of people who were saying that they would move if they had the opportunity, but I can't remember the data specifically on that.
Okay. Anyone want to make any final remarks? We've reached the end of our time now, and I suspect everyone's going to have other stuff to be doing this afternoon now. In which case, thank you to Will, Sophie, Suzanne, Lawrence, and particularly you, Rob, for making the time to do this. Do go to the website and download the report. There's an awful lot in there. Next week, we're going to be bringing out various sections of the report, sort of in a sort of easier to read or shorter format, basically. Get back to us if you've got any comments on what we've found, and we look forward to seeing you again soon at another event if you can make it. And in the meantime, I'm going to try and do this just for you, Sophie, as a final thing before Ollie turns us off. I don't know if you can actually see this, but
Oh, it's got little friends.
thanks, everyone.
So cute.
They're probably the leadership contenders.
I think the main point here is I managed to do that successfully.
Yeah, well done.
I know. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.